I'd like to start out by speaking a little bit about the theory and a few things that happen when you're trying to sew curves. First of all, when we compare it to actual compass drawing circles, you have a steady point that's stable and that you have a pencil that creates a circle and it's uniform all the way through. In the machine, the needle acts as the strong point, but you turning the cuff is actually the pencil. The only problem is that in this case, both the stable point and the pencil are moving at the same time. And therefore you have to look ahead a bit to be able to turn at the same time looking at the needle and slightly ahead of the needle at the same time. And that's the art, to create the smoothness of turning on curves. And lastly, I'd like to just state that try to use a stitch that is small enough that they're so close together that it makes the turning easier. Using a large stitch makes it almost impossible to get smooth curves or medium stitches. So use a small stitch. Just imagine being at zero. If you were at zero, it wouldn't move. The dog foot would attempt to move, but the needle would stay in one place. So you try to get away from the 0 point, less than 1, trying to create the smallest stitch possible to create the smoothness as you're watching the needle and slightly ahead to make a smooth turn, as you will see in the demonstration.
Okay, let's get into the next segment, the actual turning. We have a fusible, and I finished the clean edge already. You can do the same when you're practicing at home. But the first one is going to be the seams are included within. And again, I just want to point out that the needle, I'm going to drop the needle for a second here just so you can see what I'm doing. And so you can see the needle, and I'm also going to be looking at the outside of the foot. And I usually, there's marks here now, but I normally don't mark it. What I do is I just look a little bit from training. I just look a little bit on the side here. What I'm creating is a radius, just much like the needle on a compass, and then this is the pencil. So this is what I'm looking at, and I'm following the edge. Now the third factor will come when I get to the round edge, as you will see very shortly. And again, use a small stitch because you don't want the stitches to be too long because it becomes more difficult to turn. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to back tack. I'm going to back tack on and off, and then I'm going to follow, and I'm going to try to do it one hand. Normally I wouldn't do it one hand, but I'm going to go ahead and do it one hand so you can actually see what I'm doing. And you can see I'm following. It's no problem when it's straight. But here we go. Now I'm going to be looking at the needle, and I'm going to be turning with my left hand. So here we go. Again, I'll go around and just follow the edge. And the straight is no problem. Here we're going to go to the curve. Now when I'm watching the needle, I'm watching slightly in front. Then at the same time, the third factor is turning. I'm watching the outer. And then you go off and you back tack. And I'll show you what I've done. And you can see it's pretty smooth. Again, you can see here, and that's all it is. And this is when the seams are included. Now I'm using a contrasting thread, and I'm using a longer stitch so you can see it visually on camera. I'd use a smaller stitch even than I'm using now. But that's the turning of the seam allowance. And now let's do the other one where we're following the template. Now in the template, where I'm actually, the seams, there's no seams. And again, I'm going to drop my needle. And I'm going to back tack. Again, now it's a little different here because I'm going to be following the edge. I'm looking at the needle, following the edge, and I'm going to be looking slightly in front because I have to create the compass technique. In other words, you have the needle and you have the pencil. And that's basically what I'm doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and follow the edge. Now I'm going to do it with one hand just to show you. So I'm looking a little bit in advance, and at the same time I'm thinking I'm turning. Now you don't want to be sewing on the interface, you want to sew next to it. So I'll use two hands going here, because it's easier to turn when you don't stitch on the edge. And again, here I go, I'll be going again, I'm looking in front a little bit, and I'm turning at the same time. You got three factors that you're doing. And I'm doing it with one hand. And I'll go on, and I'll go off. And again, I'll show it to you. And that's the art. The art is it being so smooth that when you turn it, it's great. Now, I spoke earlier about the method of lifting and that so many students use, and there's really nothing wrong with it. It just takes you a little longer. You know, when you're making onesies and twosies, no problem. But if you're making 10, 15 shirts, every second, every minute matters. So here we go. So let me show you what normally what people would do. They would come around. I'm going to go superimpose over the one I just did, but they don't have any idea of how the technique works. So when they get here, they would lift their foot and they would hand sew it, and they would go ahead, maybe hand wheel it, and visually they would move it, lift their foot, move it, hand wheel it. They'd hand wheel it basically the whole thing because they're afraid it's going to get away from them. So in a way, they're hand wheeling is what they're doing. Let me demonstrate on the other side again. Here we go. Let me get to the curve actually. So what they do is they hand wheel it, turn. The only thing with this is if you're off one iota, you'll get bumps. So you have to have a small stitch, watch your radius, and usually students don't practice. This is the method they use, and they'll lift their knee lift, hand wheel it, and continue. And you can get a fairly decent curve, but believe me, teach yourself. If you're going to be in this business to do it efficiently, and you're going to do a lot of production, if you're working by yourself, you're not looking to work all day. You want to finish the project, and every second, believe it or not, when you're doing a shirt, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, it all adds up. When I tell people that you can make a shirt in 3 hours from the pattern making to the stitching, I'm not kidding. You should be able to sew cuffs in between 5 and 10 minutes with no problem. A collar in 20 to 25 minutes easily. And the body, in 1 hour, you can put the whole body together. And the sleeves is no big deal. But in this particular case, if all you're doing is cuff and collar replacement, this is how easy it is. If you're the complete shirt maker and you're learning all aspects of it, time is money. It really is. So learn the technique. Let's start the sewing. Let's turn the machine on, and we'll start with the different types. Now, as I said in the beginning, one method is to fold over the fabric over onto the wrong side, allow enough so that when you turn it in front of the machine, you're able to do either 1/4 or 3/8, and that's what I'm going to do here. Again, if you have many different colors, I wouldn't do this stitch until the end and they've been turned and ready to attach to the sleeve. So you just go ahead, it's a very simple process. And of course you can chain sew. I'm going to do one by one, but you could continue if you had a whole bunch of them. Now we're going to do right sides to right sides. Make sure you allow yourself enough fabric. And this one here has no seams. And so I'm going to go ahead and start on the edge. I'm going to go off and on. Now, some people, there's a controversy about whether they should turn. I don't normally turn. I go through it just like if it was a regular seam, and I go ahead and stitch right next to the interfacing because there's no seams on this one. And don't go on top of the interface, go right next to it because it'll be easier to turn. And there you go, a 1/4 inch past. Again, we're gonna go ahead and go. And then you'll go on and off when you get to the end. And that's it, that's the first one, okay? We're going to progress to the next one, which is the square. Now, again, I'm going to show you the method that most shirt makers do. You see this one here is a clean edge. So what most shirt makers do is they fold it over by hand. They start it. Again, I prefer to glue it, especially when you have a lot of them, and then they tuck the fabric under and you do the first stitch. Make sure you get it taut against the interfacing. This is how most shirt makers do it. A little bit of practice, but now this is a square, so we're going to have a single piece, right side to right sides. And again, this has no seams. Now, again, sometimes people will trim it before they fuse it. I prefer not to because I think it gets a cleaner finish when it's just the way you see it here. Again, I'll go ahead and stitch on and off. Remember, there's no seams in this one here. And I like to go all the way through and cross stitch. Some like to turn it. I think it gets just a better. Now remember, you want to be next to the interfacing. Don't be on it because it's easier to turn. Square or a rectangle. You go on and off. Again, there it is, on and off. Now we get to the trimming, I'll show you how to trim it, but for now we're just going to go through the sewing process. Okay, so the next one, and this is would be the round. Now this is the key. The round is you should become very proficient about how to turn. There's the needle is your focus point or the turning point, and you should learn to get this needle right where you're sewing. Let me just show you here, this one here. When we get to turning, I'll give you a little better view here. But so what you're doing basically is you're watching the needle. It's perpendicular, and you're watching that point, but at the same time you're looking at the front because you need to turn the two at the same time. And this is what people have a hard time learning, is to watch the needle sideways and then in the front. And again, you want to get it next to the interfacing. Now I have another video that I'll include as a little better view of this, but basically this is what we'll do. So again, you're watching the needle sideways, and at the same time you're looking forward to where you're going. This is the hard part for most students to learn. And once you get the hang of it, boy, you're just surprised how efficient you can really be. Okay, so there's the round. And the last one is the angle. Now the angle, again, I have turned the fabric. Now this one here is loose, but you could glue it down, and then on the right side, that is turned also. So you remember, you have right side to right side. This is the clean finish of both pieces of fabric. And of course they're already fused. And again, I state, leave about a hair on the bottom one. And again, just start. I take it back, this one here is going to have a seam, so I go on and off. Again, I like to go all the way through. I don't like to turn. Let me just show you what I'm talking about. Some people like to get to the 1/4 inch and then turn. I like to go all the way through. I think it gets a better stitch. That's my opinion. Again, now make sure that you're going to have both of them as you're stitching. Make sure they're side by side, just a hair. The top one should be just a hair back a little bit, and hold everything in place. I'm going to drop my needle. Again, make sure there's just a hair past, all during the process. Again. Okay. Now, you saw the finish. Two were pressed to the wrong side, and the reason being is because ultimately when they have the cuff, this is one where they're both pressed inside, because ultimately what's going to happen is you're going to go ahead and do your edge stitching. Now let me do that. And don't start at the bottom. Start somewhere about a 1/2 inch on top, and a small back stitch, whether it's a 1/4 or edge stitch, however you want to do it. And again, you're going to watch the needle. You'll get the hang of it. Once you get a little practice. Now you want to stop about 1/2 inch from the edge. Remember, you don't want to go all the way down. And now what you can do is you can pull it out, and I normally just go from here and do about a 1/2 inch all the way down. Now you could stop right with the stitch discontinued, or I like to go all the way down and back at the end, and you'll use a very small stitch and you'll pull it out, and of course you'll trim everything. Now the reason you do this is because when you open it, it's got a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and now when you're putting your fabric in, let's pretend this is a sleeve, it's going to stop at the stitch, and so it's going to give you an even, you can't go past the stitch, in other words. So no matter, and of course you have to allow whatever it is, if it's 3/8 or 1/2 inch here, it has to be the same on your sleeve, so that when you push the sleeve onto there, it's as far as it goes. It's going to be even from left to right or from up to down. It's going to be the same all the way through, and that's the purpose. And because it is, the top is farther away from the bottom, it'll catch both. Now here I left a little too much, but you can be a little bit more careful. And that's why a lot of times I like to use the glue stick, because I have a little bit more accuracy, but just to show you, it should be more like this, where right on the edge and it catches the bottom piece. This, you'll get away with it. You can't go wrong doing this, but if it's the other way around, you're not going to catch the sleeve. And that's where you're going to have a problem. So that's something to take into consideration. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to the table, and I'm going to show you the trimming on what we've done, just to show you a close-up view.